On what was supposed to be the most perfect, sun-drenched, destiny-sealed day of Deacon Sharp and Dr. Taylor Hayes's lives, the air inside the venue shimmered with expectation, hope, and that unmistakable soap opera hum that says joy never arrives without a price, because just as the music swelled and Taylor stood radiant in white, her smile serene and certain, and Deacon waited at the altar with misty eyes and a heart finally convinced he deserved happiness, the doors blew open both literally and metaphorically, and in walked Sheila Carter, heels clicking like a countdown clock, eyes blazing with purpose, turning I do into OHNO in the span of a single breath, because Sheila hadn't come to watch, she'd come to detonate, and with every guest frozen in disbelief, she announced that the wedding would not, go on. Her voice slicing through the room as she declared that Deacon and Taylor were standing on a lie so big it would shatter them the moment vows were spoken, and when the officiant tried to intervene and Brooke gasped and Ridge shot to his feet while Steffi whispered "Oh my God" under her breath, Sheila lifted a single hand and dropped the first bombshell, revealing that Taylor's supposed closure from her past trauma wasn't just incomplete, it was built on a deliberate omission. Because the night Taylor believed she had confronted her demons and forgiven herself for the shooting years ago, Deacon had been there, not as a bystander, not as a coincidence, but as the man who quietly altered the truth to protect himself, a revelation that sent a visible shockwave through Taylor as she turned slowly toward Deacon, her veil trembling as her voice cracked asking him what Sheila meant, and Deacon, pale and cornered, tried to deny it, tried to laugh it off as another Sheila Carter fantasy. But Sheila, reveling in the moment, exposed the truth with surgical cruelty, explaining that Deacon had known years ago that evidence existed proving Taylor's memory of that night was flawed, that her guilt was heavier than it should have been, and instead of helping her heal honestly, he let her live with that burden because the truth would have implicated him in a chain of events that nearly destroyed multiple lives, and as murmurs turned into gasps and whispers into outrage, Sheila pushed further. Because she hadn't just stopped the wedding, she'd hijacked it, declaring wedding day disaster. With a grin as she revealed she had proof, audio recordings, witness statements, and a long-buried confession from a man Deacon had paid off to stay silent, a man who could confirm that Deacon had manipulated circumstances the night Taylor believed she was alone with her guilt, and Taylor's face crumpled as realization set in, that the man she loved, trusted, and was about to marry had stood beside her through therapy sessions, tears, and breakthroughs, all while knowing she was healing from a version of the truth he helped rewrite, and the room seemed to tilt as Taylor whispered that Deacon had sworn there were no secrets between them, and Sheila, savoring every second, snapped back that secrets were Deacon's specialty, that the charming smile and reformed man routine were just that, a routine, and then, just when it seemed the devastation couldn't deepen, Sheila delivered the revelation that changed everything, exposing that Deacon's motivation wasn't just self-preservation but fear that if Taylor ever uncovered the full truth, she would realize that her bond with Ridge, her shared past, and her unresolved feelings were never truly gone, and that marrying Deacon was less about love and more about safety, a claim that made Ridge stiffen and Brooke's eyes widen as decades of complicated history flooded back into the room, and Deacon finally snapped, shouting that Sheila was lying, that she was obsessed, that she was doing this out of jealousy and spite, but his words rang hollow as Sheila played a short recording on her phone, a distorted but unmistakable snippet of Deacon admitting he couldn't let Taylor find out, not yet, and the silence afterward was deafening, Taylor's hand slipping from Deacon's grasp as tears streamed down her face, her voice barely audible as she asked how long had he planned to let her live in a lie, and Deacon, shattered and desperate, confessed that he'd meant to tell her, that he loved her, that he was trying to protect what they had, but protection sounded an awful lot like control in that moment, and Sheila, arms crossed in triumph, declared from IDOTOOHNO. As she reminded everyone that love built on deception always collapses, especially when she's the one holding the matches, and chaos erupted as guests argued, Brooke confronted Deacon, Ridge tried to comfort Taylor, Steffi stood frozen between rage and heartbreak, and the officiant quietly closed his book, signaling what everyone already knew, that there would be no vows today, no kiss, no happily ever after, only questions, pain, and the echo of Sheila's laughter as she proclaimed that the truth always comes out, especially when people like her decide the timing is right, and as security finally escorted Sheila out, she turned back one last time, locking eyes with Deacon and delivering the final twist, revealing that this wasn't even everything, that there were still secrets Deacon hadn't faced yet, secrets that would make today look merciful by comparison, leaving Deacon and Taylor left stunned at the altar, their future erased in real time, and as Taylor removed her veil and placed it gently on the chair beside her, whispering that she needed space, that she needed truth, and that she didn't know who Deacon was anymore, the wedding dissolved into aftermath, into broken hearts and unresolved pasts, proving once again that in the world of B&B, no love story escapes unscathed, especially when Sheila Carter decides it's time to tell the truth. Because what was meant to be a celebration became a cautionary tale, a wedding day disaster etched into memory, where one secret turned devotion into devastation and changed everything forever. In the stunned, suffocating silence that followed Sheila Carter's explosive exit, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in with brutal clarity, because this wasn't just a wedding that had been interrupted. It was an entire future that had collapsed in front of witnesses who would never forget the sound of Taylor Hayes' heartbreaking, and as guests awkwardly shuffled, unsure whether to leave or stay. The emotional wreckage remained firmly at the altar where Deacon stood frozen, tuxedo wrinkled, eyes hollow, realizing that the one moment he'd believed could finally redeem him had instead cemented his worst fears, while Taylor, trembling but composed in that distinctly Taylor way, slowly stepped away, every movement deliberate, as though she were physically distancing herself not just from Deacon but from the version of herself that had believed in him, and Ridge instinctively moved toward her, not as an interloper but as the man who had known her pain longer than anyone, his hand hovering uncertainly at her back, unsure whether comfort would be welcomed or rejected, and Brooke watched it all unfold with a familiar ache, recognizing that look, that tragic gravitational pull between Ridge and Taylor that seemed to resurface whenever the world fell apart, while Deacon, sensing the shift, snapped back to life and demanded that Taylor listen to him, that she not let Sheila win, but Taylor turned on him with a quiet fury far more devastating than any scream, telling him that Sheila didn't win anything because the truth he'd hidden was real, that whether Sheila's motives were pure or poisonous didn't change the fact that he had robbed her of agency, of the right to heal honestly, and that betrayal, once exposed, had a way of poisoning every memory that came before it, and Deacon's voice cracked as he insisted he loved her, that every moment they shared was real, but Taylor countered that love without honesty wasn't love at all, it was fear dressed up as devotion, and with that, she walked away from the altar, leaving behind gasps, whispers, and a man who suddenly looked smaller than he ever had before. As the venue emptied, the aftermath spread like wildfire across Los Angeles, because weddings might end quietly in real life, but in the world of Forrester drama, they echo through boardrooms, living rooms, and hospital corridors, and within hours, phones were buzzing, alliances were shifting, and opinions were hardening, with Steffi furious that Deacon had dared to hurt her mother this deeply, vowing that whatever secret Sheila claimed still remained would never be allowed to surface without consequences, while Hope, torn between loyalty to her father and compassion for Taylor, found herself grappling with the unbearable realization that Deacon's past wasn't just following him, it was actively shaping his present, and when Hope confronted Deacon later that night, her voice shaking as she asked him why he hadn't told the truth, Deacon broke down completely, admitting that he was terrified that the truth would confirm what he'd always suspected, that Taylor had chosen him because he was safe, not because he was irreplaceable, and Hope, heartbroken but honest, told him that safety built on lies was never real safety, and that he might have lost Taylor the moment he decided to decide for her. Meanwhile, Taylor retreated into herself, seeking solitude but finding none, because memories long buried began resurfacing with unsettling clarity, moments she'd dismissed, conversations she'd accepted at face value, now replaying with new meaning, and the more she examined them, the more cracks she saw, and it terrified her, not just because Deacon had lied, but because she'd trusted him during her most vulnerable moments, and that trust had been sacred to her, and Ridge, unable to stay away, despite promising himself he wouldn't interfere, showed up quietly, bringing tea, not answers, sitting beside her in silence until she finally spoke, asking him how she could have been so wrong, and Ridge, with rare humility, told her she hadn't been wrong to believe that loving someone was never a weakness, but that sometimes people we want to trust most are the ones who hide the hardest truths. And when Taylor asked him whether he thought Deacon had ever truly seen her, Ridge hesitated, then admitted that Deacon loved the idea of being the man who saved her, not necessarily the woman she was becoming, and that realization hit Taylor like another blow, because she'd spent years working to reclaim her autonomy, her identity, only to discover she'd unknowingly surrendered it again. But Sheila Carter was far from finished, because chaos was her currency, and while the wedding destruction had satisfied her in the moment, the real power lay in what came next, and true to form, Sheila resurfaced days later with cryptic messages, hinting at another revelation, another truth Deacon hadn't faced, and when confronted by Finn, who demanded to know why she couldn't just leave their lives alone, Sheila smirked and declared that she wasn't destroying lives, she was exposing them. Claiming that Deacon's secret wasn't just about Taylor's past but about a deal he'd made years ago, one that tied him to a chain of events involving illegal favors, falsified reports, and a moment that could cost him everything if revealed. And though Finn warned her to stay away, Sheila thrived on the warning, because nothing thrilled her more than being underestimated. As tensions escalated, Deacon found himself unraveling, haunted by the possibility that Sheila really did hold more ammunition, and when he finally confronted her, demanding to know what she wanted, Sheila delivered her most chilling truth yet, telling him she didn't want money, revenge, or forgiveness. She wanted acknowledgement, wanted him to admit that he wasn't the hero of his own story, that he'd always been one step away from becoming the villain, and Deacon, exhausted and desperate, asked her why she cared so much, and Sheila replied that watching people pretend they were better than her was unbearable, that exposing their hypocrisy was her way of leveling the playing field, and in that moment, Deacon realized that even if he escaped legal consequences, he might never escape the shadow Sheila had cast over his life. Back at Forrester, conversations shifted as the ripple effects of the failed wedding reached every corner, with Brooke questioning whether the timing of Taylor's engagement had ever been about moving forward or simply moving away, and Steffi bristling at the implication, fiercely defending her mother while privately fearing that old wounds were reopening. And when Taylor finally returned to work, she was greeted with sympathetic smiles and careful silence, but what unsettled her most was how familiar it all felt, like history repeating itself with cruel precision. And when she crossed paths with Deacon unexpectedly, the pain was immediate and raw, and though he begged for a chance to explain, she told him she needed more than explanations, she needed accountability, and until he confronted every truth, even the ones Sheila hadn't revealed yet, there was no path forward. And just when it seemed the fallout had stabilized, Sheila struck again, leaking a partial document anonymously, igniting speculation and fear, and though the full truth remained obscured, the damage was done, because uncertainty is its own form of destruction, and Deacon was left scrambling, Taylor was left questioning everything, and the people around them were left bracing for the next impact, because in this world, secrets never stay buried, weddings never fail quietly, and the distance from idea to disaster is always just one truth away. And as the dust settled over what had been meant to be a joyful union, one thing became painfully clear: Sheila Carter hadn't just stopped a wedding, she'd reset the entire board, and whatever came next would be even more devastating than what had already been revealed. The days following Sheila Carter's latest anonymous leak felt heavier, charged with the kind of dread that seeps into every conversation and glance, because no one knew exactly what the document contained in full, only that it was enough to make Deacon Sharp visibly unravel and enough to keep Taylor Hayes awake at night, staring into the dark and wondering how many versions of her own life had been shaped by other people's choices. And while the city buzzed with speculation, the real damage unfolded quietly, in fractured relationships and unspoken fears, as Deacon isolated himself more and more, convinced that every knock at the door might be the police. Every phone call another accusation, and every memory a potential crime scene, while Taylor, determined not to be pulled back into chaos, threw herself into her work, counseling patients through trauma even as she navigated her own, painfully aware of the irony that she could help others untangle their pain while her own story felt like a maze with no exit. At Forrester Creations, tension hummed beneath the polished surfaces, because fashion houses might trade in beauty and illusion, but secrets rot just as quickly there as anywhere else, and Brooke found herself torn between empathy and exhaustion, watching Ridge struggle with his instincts, torn between supporting Taylor as a friend and protecting himself from repeating old mistakes. And when Brooke finally confronted him, asking whether he was falling back into the familiar pattern of being Taylor's rescuer, Ridge surprised her by admitting that this time felt different, that Taylor wasn't looking to be saved, she was reclaiming herself, and that realization both relieved and unsettled Brooke, because independence had a way of changing dynamics, and she couldn't ignore the quiet fear that once Taylor stood fully on her own, old choices might look very different. Meanwhile, Steffi's fury hardened into resolve, because watching her mother be humiliated and emotionally blindsided ignited something fierce in her, and she made it clear to everyone, including Finn, that Sheila would not get away with this unscathed, and while Finn urged restraint, reminding Steffi that feeding Sheila attention was exactly what she wanted, Steffi countered that silence was how Sheila always won, how she slipped through consequences and rewrote narratives, and that this time the truth needed to be dragged into the light on their terms, not Sheila's, and so Steffi began quietly digging, leveraging connections, calling in favors, determined to uncover what Sheila was holding and why Deacon was so terrified of it, because if there was one thing Steffi understood, it was that power lived in information. Deacon, sensing the walls closing in, made a decision that terrified him more than any threat Sheila had ever issued. He decided to tell the truth himself, or at least as much of it as he could before Sheila twisted it beyond recognition, and he requested a meeting with Taylor, not to plead, not to explain, but to confess, and though Taylor hesitated, she ultimately agreed, not because she owed him anything, but because she needed clarity to move forward, and when they finally sat across from each other, the air thick with unresolved emotion, Deacon didn't soften the story or cast himself as a victim, instead admitting that years ago, when Taylor's memories of the shooting were fragmented and painful, he had come across information that contradicted part of the official narrative, information that suggested her culpability had been exaggerated, but revealing it would have exposed his own involvement in tampering with evidence related to a separate incident, one that Sheila now clearly knew about, and as he spoke, Taylor listened, expression controlled but eyes glassy, absorbing the weight of his words, and when he finished, she asked the question that cut deepest, whether he ever planned to tell her if Sheila hadn't intervened, and Deacon, voice barely above a whisper, admitted that he didn't know, because every time he considered it, fear won. That admission, more than any document or recording, sealed something between them, because fear, Taylor realized, had been the silent third party in their relationship all along, shaping decisions, justifying omissions, and when she finally stood to leave, she told Deacon that while she appreciated his honesty now, it came too late to rebuild trust, and that she couldn't build a future on truths dragged out under threat, and Deacon, devastated but accepting, watched her walk away knowing that even if Sheila vanished tomorrow, the damage was done. But Sheila, predictably, had no intention of vanishing, because the more people tried to contain her, the more she thrived, and when she realized Deacon had begun confessing, she escalated, arranging a calculated public confrontation that would ensure maximum fallout, and she chose her stage carefully, orchestrating circumstances so that Ridge, Brooke, Taylor, Steffi, and Deacon all ended up in the same room, under the guise of an unrelated gathering, and when Sheila revealed herself unapologetic and smug, she wasted no time unleashing her next revelation, claiming that Deacon's actions years ago hadn't just protected himself but had indirectly endangered someone else, someone whose life was permanently altered as a result, and though she didn't name the person, the implication was enough to send shockwaves through the room, and when Steffi demanded proof, Sheila smiled and said proof was coming, but only if people stopped pretending Deacon was the only one with something to lose. That statement shifted the narrative instantly, because now the question wasn't just what Deacon had done, but who else had benefited from the lie, and eyes began turning toward Ridge, toward Brooke, toward anyone who might have been indirectly shielded by the altered truth, and Taylor felt a fresh wave of betrayal, not just personal but systemic, realizing that her pain had been collateral damage in a web far larger than she'd known, and when she confronted Sheila directly, demanding to know why she was doing this, Sheila answered with unsettling honesty, saying that she was tired of being the only monster in the room, tired of carrying the label of irredeemable while others hid behind respectability and forgiveness, and that if she had to be exposed, everyone would be. Wait alone, that time might blur the edges, that perhaps fate will intervene, or that Finn's devotion to Steffi and Steffi's unyielding belief in their marriage could somehow shield all of them from the consequences. Yet the universe has a cruel habit of exposing secrets no matter how carefully they are hidden, and as the days pass and her pregnancy advances, every glance she shares with Finn becomes loaded with unspoken tension, every silence stretches unbearably long, and the heartbeat of The child within her becomes a relentless metronome marking the inexorable countdown to upheaval, while Finn, caught between shock, guilt, and an undeniable sense of responsibility, scrambles to compartmentalize, to anchor himself to the life he built with Steffi as if sheer determination could erase the one reckless moment that shifted everything irreversibly. But Steffi, ever perceptive and proud, senses the subtle fractures before she knows the truth, noticing the distracted eyes, the forced smiles, the restless nights where Finn's mind seems to wander elsewhere, her unease blossoming into suspicion, suspicion into confrontation, until the revelation detonates like a bomb she never anticipated, not offered as confession but thrown into her world as an undeniable fact. Hope is pregnant with Finn's child, and in that instant, Steffi's carefully constructed reality collapses. The marriage she fought so hard to protect becomes a fragile shell of promises that no longer hold, and the shock slices through her heart with a precision that leaves her reeling, reliving every insecurity, every betrayal past and present, every fear she thought conquered, while Finn pleads, stammering explanations and declarations of love, insisting it was a mistake, that he wants to make things right, that Steffi remains his heart's choice, but she hears only the echo of treachery, sees a future forever shadowed by a child not hers, and recognizes with painful clarity that staying would be a life lived in perpetual comparison, a life measured against the unchangeable truth of hope and Finn's bond, a constant, silent reminder of what was lost and what can never be recovered. And so the woman who once believed love could conquer all reaches a breaking point, and from marriage to meltdown, she chooses herself over the fragments of a marriage that has become an emotional trap, filing for divorce not in rage but in exhaustion. In the quiet clarity that the moment hope's secret emerged, the marriage had effectively ended, and the legal documents she signs become more than separation, they are her declaration that she will not remain a secondary figure in a story defined by